right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this special lecture. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, one of the co-sponsors of today's event, as well as a professor in the political science department and here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. It's a great honor and privilege to welcome Dr. Im today. Many of you have known his work about victimhood nationalism, and as you can tell from my colleagues gathered in the room, many of us here at GW are very interested in memory and reconciliation in East Asia as well as other parts of the world. So I'll just offer a brief opening on behalf of all of our co-sponsors of today's event. So besides GWIX, this event is also sponsored by the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, and Bruce Dixon is the director of that. So thank you for organizing everything and for Adam for doing the work for setting this up today. Another of our co-sponsors is the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, or IRES here. And a number of colleagues and students are also affiliated with IRES, and thank you for co-sponsoring that as well. The history department, I will introduce in a minute my colleague Dacheng Yang, who is a professor in the history department, was also a co-sponsor of today's event. And I think I'm not forgetting any. So, without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Dacheng Yang, who is many of you know has studied the historical memory and technology and the Japanese Empire and East Asian relations. He teaches history, memory, and violence regularly here at GW, which is perfect for today's talk. So Dacheng is going to introduce our speaker today, but let me just add, it's a great honor to meet you, in part also because I'll be spending the fall at Sogang, affiliated with Sogang. So I look forward to seeing you in Seoul again. But thank you very much for coming today, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Arrington, for this introduction. My name is Dacheng Yang. I'm Associate Professor of History and International Affairs. I mainly teach Japan, but also I got interested in comparative memory studies, which is quite fitting to today's subject. I want to thank each of our sponsors, co-sponsors. Their financial contribution allows our very, very small memory studies project to stage events together. And also want to thank the staff members, Adam has already mentioned, Havin, Ravina, Amelia, they all did a lot of work behind the scene. I'm also very grateful to Professor Jie-Hyun for accepting our invitation to come down from Massachusetts. With two highly original and recently published books, in quick succession, he's a speaker in high demand. The fact that we have so many co-sponsors also testifies to the unusual breadth and depth of his expertise. Professor Lim was born in Seoul, Republic of Korea, shortly before Park Chung-hee's coup d'etat. During his student days at Sogang, he already had engaged in clandestine anti-authoritarian activities, which got him into trouble. To put mildly, in 1989, he finalized his dissertation, I hope that's correct, Marx and Engels on the national question. So his interest in the issue of nationalism go way back. 1989, of course, is a crucial year in history, the end of communism in Eastern, or the beginning of the end of the communism in Eastern Europe, the Tiananmen incident in China. And after that, Professor Lim went to Poland shortly after the fall of communism, and where he encountered the transition from real socialism to market economy and democracy. Contrasting what his experience and aspirations as a student in South Korea, which was just coming out of military dictatorship, with the post-communist Eastern Europe presented him with many new discoveries and insights, which eventually led to what he called the global East, East Asia and Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, which allowed him to, quote, escape the intellectual complacency, be it left or right. Because some of these categories have been turned upside down when you cross that artificial boundary. So I've known Professor Lim for many years. First, I think we met at one of the AAS, Association for Asian Studies. And then, but it was really in Poland, when I did my sabbatical, I discovered more about Professor Lim. When I heard the rumor among my Polish colleagues that there was this Asian scholar who not only understand the jokes in Polish language, but also can make jokes. Wow, who is this person? And then lo and behold, it was Professor Jie-Hyun. So again, I'm really grateful. And when I asked him to come down, and he immediately accepted, and he noted that there's something special about the audience in Washington. You remember saying that. So I hope we don't disappoint him, and you'll get some questions ready for the Q&A at the end of our discussion and the lecture. Jie, I'm very happy to see you in Washington, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That's what I've been here. I'm extremely pleased to share my ideas and some opinions with all of you, especially about victimhood nationalism. I mean, is there anyone here who was born before the Second World War? No one, right? But very strangely enough, many post-war generation tends to regard themselves as victims of the war atrocities and colonial genocide and Holocaust or different sort of things that happened even before they were born. How is it possible, existentially or physically, to be a victim by this certain historical event that happened before we were born? But very often we found ourselves to perceive ourselves as a victim of certain historical tragedies that happened before we were born. I think that this is a basic premise of victimhood nationalism anyway. So regardless of whether it is in Europe or Asia or Middle East or here and there. I mean, actually, what matters? Let me start with the definition of victimhood nationalism. Victimhood nationalism is a narrative template of history and memory, which grants the moral and political legitimacy to a nation which inherits lived victim experiences of ancestors in the form of post-memory. I mean, because my students who were born in 21st century, they regard themselves as victims of Japanese colonial rule. This is simple things, but also we can see nowadays many former victimized nations become more and more aggressive towards their neighbors, just on the ground that they were victimized once, right? But on the one hand, it's understandable those real victims tend to regard themselves as victims because they were real victims. Then why? Why post-war generations, actually who sometimes very much benefited from the present history, why these guys regard themselves as victims of the historical tragedies, and what kind of role does that sort of self-perception play in the international realms and the certain international relations? This is a question of victimhood nationalism. I never means that all the memories in a given society are oriented towards victimhood. So I use the term of template. There are different variety of memories, but my focus in this book is on this victimhood nationalism as a template of memory and history, regardless of there are certain dissonant memories and the disowning memories, but still I put a focus on the formation of the memory templates of victimhood nationalism. And then, to be honest, in my Polish learning, especially Zygmunt Bauman, his term of hereditary victimhood, I had an interview with him in 2002 for the Korean Journal and this, and then at that time, we were talking about this, his new, coined the term of hereditary victimhood. And at that time, I found this is fascinating. This Zygmunt Bauman termed this term in describing or analyzing a certain victim culture in contemporary Poland and Israel, because he was kicked off from the party in 1968 during the anti-Zionist campaign, and he fled to Israel. And he said to me, "Oh, Jie-Hyun, when I began to learn this Hebrew language in the language textbook in Israel, I could immediately recognize that if I learned Hebrew language through this book, I would be a Zionist in a year." And they just having left a very critical remark on the contemporary nationalist culture in Israel, he moved to Leeds and he has, taught at Leeds University till the end of it. But at that time I thought, oh, this hereditary victimhood is also our story. So at that time in 1992, between 92 and 97, I used a term of, for instance, hereditary victimhood and post-nationalist historiography in East Asia. And at that time, still, I didn't have a term of victimhood nationalism. Only after in 2007, I came to coin the term of victimhood nationalism. Later, that also, if you have a look at 19th century Polish history, Adam Mickiewicz, this crucified nation, is a very well-known metaphor among the Korean nationalists. But very interestingly enough, Matsuoka Yosuke, who was the ambassador to League of Nations, when Japan was just going out of the League of Nations, he described Japan as a crucified nation. I'm still wondering if this guy, the Matsuoka Yosuke, read Adam Mickiewicz or some of his political aides actually advised him to use this Mickiewicz term of crucified nation. Because crucified nation is a very typical Adam Mickiewicz term. And there are some peculiar Polish terms like crucified nation by Adam Mickiewicz, or national megalomania, which is a self-critical remark on the Polish nationalism. But these are very much Polish words. So in other countries, one cannot find these things. So anyway, in this milieu of intellectual milieu, Polish-Jewish self-criticism of Polish nationalism actually has led me to the certain rough idea of the victimhood nationalism, I would say. Also, when we have a look at this, I just used 4 or 5 languages in writing these books. There is certain difference between European language and the scenographic language about the differentiation between victimhood and sacrifices. In German, Opfer, or Slavic word Ofiara, it just actually carries double meanings. There is no differentiation between victims and sacrifices. But in the scenography world, we have a very apparent differentiation between victims and sacrifices. So I would say that victimhood nationalism appears on the scene in the transition from 희가이샤 to 기세이샤, or from victims to sacrifices. I mean that, those victims, they don't know why they had to die. Right? They didn't give the meanings to their deaths, just they were innocent deaths. But later, this post-generation began to give the certain specific meanings to death, and then it just changes their status from innocent victims to the righteous sacrifices who sacrifice oneself for the nation or revolution or something else. So I would say victimhood nationalism appears on the scene in the transition from victimhood to the sacrifices. So victimhood nationalism is not the accurate term, but I think that I couldn't think of any other alternative other than victimhood nationalism for now. And also, many people said, "Oh, Jie-Hyun, okay, I think that the memory culture in East Asia is relatively similar to memory culture in Eastern Europe. But what those memories were entangled?" I say, histories, they were not entangled. For instance, comfort women in East Asia, they never ever had a chance to meet the Holocaust victims in the course of Second World War. But after the war, in United States, those comfort women victims and Holocaust survivors began to meet. So I prefer the term of entangled memories to entangled histories. So our memories are more closely entangled than histories in the course of the Second World War. This is a basic a starting point of this work. And then I think the Eastern Europe and East Asia, though in Korea, we always say, oh, Korean nation is most peace-loving nation. We never invaded other countries. We never colonized other countries. And then if you go to Eastern Europe, you say all this, oh, we are better whites. We are good whites because we never colonized other countries. These are really bad whites are Western European whites, but we Eastern European whites are really much better whites and good whites. I say, yes, it's true you didn't colonize, not because you didn't want, but because you couldn't. I always say it to my post like that. So I mean, you had always had kept a very strong desire to colonize other parts. If you have a look at the Polish imagination of Africa, and even Ukraine and Galicia, they always called our India. It's the Galicia, the western part of today's Ukraine was called by Polish India. And then the guy who coined that term was a Polish guy who was working in the Ministry of India in London. So he knows how to British guys orientalize this India, and he just applied the same British Orientalist view to India in the relationship between Poland and Galicia. We can see full of these, examples how this actually, from the viewpoint of post-colonial perspective, actually even Poland under the partitions of three countries actually was not totally free from of this colonial desire. I would say same thing can be applied to the Korea and the both Koreas and the other places. So this is also problematic. Now Western Europeans, they cannot really deny, right, the certain coloniality in their past colonial atrocities. But in Eastern Europe, in the lesser part of East Asia, because they never colonized the other countries, they presume wrongly that we are very good people. We never ever tried to colonize. We didn't colonize. That's the problem of today's contemporary certain political cultures or memory cultures in these both Eastern Europe and East Asia, I would say. This is, 60th anniversary of Bantung Conference. I was shocked when I just spot this photo. My God, Xi Jinping and Abe represent the anti-colonial liberation tradition in East Asia. I think this is really shows how the hypocritical of the so-called anti-colonial or post-colonial national liberation movement. So still, many Japanese, certain conservative nationalists regard themselves, Japan has been a victim by the Western colonialism, right? But I would say that American imperialism, Japan was, the first national liberation movement was American Revolution against the British Empire. It shows that how even the national liberation movement can be degenerated into the imperial power, depending on the historical context. So Japan was invaded or just attacked by the Western imperialism never guarantees Japan has been always a good nationalism or protest nationalism. So this is the and then the subaltern empire and colonial. George Sand already wrote a very interesting review article about the subaltern empire in the Japan. And subaltern empire, actually, Russian guys, they coined that term to define Russian imperialism as a sort of marginalized imperialism. And I would say it's actually Japan's empire also can be categorized as a subaltern empire. And even Nazism, Nazi Germany, and Italian fascism, actually their colonial power or colonial desire can be categorized, I think, as a part of this, a subaltern empire. Okay, transfer coloniality, and then actually, when I was just reading some history of Manchukuo in 1980s, I was so shocked to find out that, oh my God, all the dictatorial policies employed by Park Chung-hee actually was mimicry on the Manchukuo model. And also we found that even the registration card 주민등록증 was a replica of Manchukuo system. And also many higher bureaucrats who was working on the economic planning and all the important administrative office in 1960s, 70s, Park Chung-hee's developmental dictatorship regime, they were trained in Manchukuo as a, rank and file bureaucrats in the Japanese empire. So I would say even though there is a visible continuity of this coloniality between Japanese empire and the post-colonial Koreas, all those things I think that in a sense form certain very extensive background to critically understanding victimhood nationalism today. So, I just tried to modify Hannah Arendt's criticism of binary of collective guilt and collective innocence into colonial guilt and colonial innocence. Because we are colonized by the Japanese colonialism, we are colonially innocent. That's not wrong. That's true, partly, but also it is very problematic because it works out as a screen memory to hide this colonial desire that has been dormant or very deeply embedded to the modern and contemporary history of a Korean peninsula. So all those things can be just outlined as a background for victimhood nationalism. And this is a typical thing. This is a Yoko Kawashima Watkins book so far from the Bamboo Grove. It's a story, Hikiage story, but it's about like a East Asia version of Fair Tribal, right? Like the 12 million German expellees, from the former East Prussian territories on the way back to repatriation to Germany. They suffered from various, atrocities. But also Japanese civilians who stayed in the China, Manchuria, and the northern part of Korean peninsula on their repatriation at the end of Second World War, they suffered from all those different things. So that it's true they suffered, but the Korean nation, when this book was enlisted as a reading list for the 8th and 9th grades in the Massachusetts in New York City, Korean Americans raised their voice, their concern about this book, but their criticism was very strange. It is simple lie, pure lie. So I said, no, she does not lie. It's true. Perpetrators also can suffer. Not only victims suffer, but also perpetrators in a certain given conditions they can suffer. Problem with this book is not that she is lying, but that she dehistoricized, decontextualized the story. Why this Japanese family had to leave to a Korean peninsula and why they had to suffer from this sort of retaliation and revenges from Koreans and Chinese. And this historical background is totally erased from. So that's our problem. Decontextualization and dehistoricization could be a problem, but the criticism from Korean nationalists was, she's pure lie and simple lie. Even they just spread the rumor that her father was this notorious 731 Japanese medical unit doctor, because it's a rumor. It's just suspicion, and then even nobody could prove that, but it's okay already. So it's a way of discredit. This Yoko Kawashima Watkins already done. And that is interestingly enough, this, in Japan, there is a very splendid tradition of Hikiage monogatari, very good Hikiage stories, there are a lot. So this was just nothing compared to the very rich tradition of Hikiage monogatari, but when this book became the focus of a certain debate by the Korean American diaspora community in the United States, and then it was imported to South Korea, and then in Korea it became a focus of this debate. Then Japanese nationalists picked up this book and they translated it into Japanese very late. So it's a Hado Shupan. So I just translated this Hado Shupan, this book in the Japan, Amazon Japan.com. This Hado Shupan published the books of these imperial textbooks, imperial history textbooks in 1930s and 40s. So all these we could smell, it smells a certain, nostalgia towards the imperial glories and imperial past. And it shows how this Hikiage story that has been targeted by the long-distance nationalism by the Korean Americans, actually made an impact to the Japan and to strengthen the position of Japanese right-wing nationalists who have a very strong nostalgia to the imperial past. But funnily enough, in Korea, this Fujiwara case, this Hikiage story was translated into Korean in 1952. Still, it remains one of 50 bestsellers after the Second World War. Because, it was during the Korean War, so many Korean refugees might have felt a certain very strong empathy to those Japanese refugees, regardless of whether they belong to Japanese nation or Korean nations. But, some extreme conditions of war conditions, all those, the people who suffered from the war had shared a certain empathy in common. So this is still one of the facts. But this one is actually was translated into Korean 2005. It's a wife of my close friend who is literary critic. She translated it, but at that time, it has a warm response from the Korean press. Oh, this is a typical Bildungsroman to show how 11 years old Japanese girls suffered from this very tragic history, but who could become a really, the reliable and the very well-educated adults and success story. So romance building. Then suddenly when this Korean American community in New York City and Boston area began to attack this a book, it was this long-distance nationalists imported to South Korea. And then on a sudden day, 4 different Korean newspapers published simultaneous criticism of this book, January 17 or 18 of 2007. So I found this, because I'm subscribing to extreme right-wing, left-wing newspapers at home. It's very rare. These 2 newspapers publish same orientation articles. So I found this is a bit strange. Something smells, right? So I just dug in all these archaeological things, and then there was one guy in Boston who was the 한겨레 신문 correspondent, but who became a diplomat and general consul under the so-called democratic government, and she was actually a director of all these fun things. And then, so I at the time I wrote a small article, a Victimhood Nationalism, for the first time in the Korean newspapers in English, Korean Herald. Then I began to receive a protest emails from those Korean Americans. How on earth can a historian like you teach history in Korea? And then this sort of thing, they were really angry. But I think that they were, how can I say, their history education was very poor. Even though the title of that organization was PAHE, means that Parents for Accurate Asian History Education. So they said positivistically they are right. They are talking about only truth. But this Yoko Hashima Watkins is talking about only lies. But it's not that simple. As I said, the problem is this dehistoricization and decontextualization. Okay, it's unfair to compare, Günter Grass with Yoko Hashima Watkins, but this Günter Grass book was actually provoked lots of debates when it was published in Germany, because it's about the story of German expellees from the East Prussian territories. 12 million civilians expelled from the territories, and among them, between 1.5 million and 2 million people were just killed. on the repatriation. So, I mean, the scale of tragedy and these numbers are not comparable with the Japanese Hikari story. And then Günter Grass, as a sort of social democratic writer, or who was very close to SPD, he began to say that we should not keep silence to the suffering of those German expellees. It's true they were suffered, but all this, their suffering is only dealt with by the right-wing writers and right-wing, these politicians. So, as a social democrat in Germany, I think that how to tackle this question is one of the very important things in the understanding memory studies. But in this book, I think Günter Grass made a very, very deep historical research. First of all, the Wilhelm Gustloff that was torpedoed by the Russian Red Army submarine, and about 9,000 civilians on the boat were killed. But Wilhelm Gustloff was the name of Nazi High Commissioner in Switzerland. So already the name of the ship was involved in the Nazi crime, and also this ship transported Condor Legion from the Spain to Germany after the end of Spanish Civil War, means that the Condor Legion, which bombarded Guernica, actually was transported by this ship to Germany. And also this ship was used in the Nazi project of, Strength Through Joy. It's a sort of, how can I say, sort of leisure program for the German workers that was employed by Nazis. And also, he didn't forget to mention that those civilians in the former East European patriotic Germans and Sudeten Germans and the Schlesien Germans, they showed a very high vote rate for the Nazi party compared to the other Germany. So Günter Grass did not deny that those German expellees on the board of Wilhelm Gustloff were victimized. But on the other hand, he did not forget to talk about very historical complexities under which those victims were also involved in the Nazi crimes and something like that. So I would say decontextualization or over-contextualization. I mean, for instance, the Korean and the East European guys say that, because we were colonized, we are not guilty, and this is over-contextualization, over-historicization of the, the history of being colonized. But in this case, perpetrator nations, they tend to dehistoricize and decontextualize the historical context under which those, though they are victims, has been situated. So this was the beginning of Victimhood Nationalism. But also, there are different stories. For instance, Japanese scholars know that Murakami Hansai sets, right? Usually, I have been very familiar to the former director of the Jewish Institute of History in Warsaw, Felix Dich. He always complaining that, Yad Vashem guys insist that they were the first to use the Holocaust in the public realm. But according to Felix Dich, it is our Jewish Institute of History in Warsaw who used the term of this Holocaust for the first time. No, both of you are wrong. It was Japanese Catholic Dr. Nagai Takashi who used the term of Holocaust for the first time in the public domain in his address to console the victims of Catholic victims of Nagasaki by the A bombing. Of course, he used the Japanese translation of Hansai, but Hansai is a literal translation of Holocaust, right? It was already 1945, November 23. So this is a written. We have a manuscript, all these historical records to show that how this Hansai has been used by Nagai Takashi in November 1945. So even the Holocaust has been used by Japan for the first time after the Second World War. And then the other thing is the Maximilian Kolbe in Nagasaki. And Endo Shusaku wrote a novel on the Maximilian Kolbe as a saint in Auschwitz and Nagasaki, and he tried to connect saints of Nagasaki to saints of Auschwitz. But I was shocked when I visited Nagasaki for the first time. My God, this Kolbe is that Kolbe whom I know? Because there was a very sharp debate, not a very hot debates, but underground or relatively marginalized debates. But Maximilian Kolbe was a terrible anti-Semite. He was the founder of the Journal of Marxian, which was a forum of very strong anti-Semitism in interwar Poland. Of course, some people advocate Maximilian Kolbe because he was just a founder. He was staying in Japan mainly, and also he was a very moderate. He even agreed to the conversion of Jews from Jews to the Catholicism, and a very combatant anti-Semite does not allow that sort of conversion, while Maximilian Kolbe allowed it. But still, I think that the question is whether he was really moderate anti-Semite or very combatant anti-Semite. So nobody can deny it. I had a full of his texts shows that all those metaphors he used is really, the metaphors that has been used by the anti-Semites in the 10th century very often. So, but problem is that this sort of, how can I say, cross-referencing Holocaust in East Asia or cross-referencing a bombing in Eastern Europe, how often this sort of cross-referencing of the other sufferings have been decontextualized from out of context. So when I talk about Maximilian Kolbe and the Nagasaki, and it's a few years ago in Kyoto, and my close friend, who is a very well-known Japanese left-wing intellectual, and he was brought up in the Catholic family, he was shocked to know that Maximilian Kolbe was anti-Semite. When I was a child, we used to pray for Maximilian Kolbe at the dinner table. But they never knew that, really. But I was also shocked to know that, my God, Japanese Catholic, those liberal Catholics never knew that Maximilian Kolbe was anti-Semite. This sort of very strange juxtaposition can be found from the global memory space here and there. So victimhood nationalism is, how can I say, it's a way about working, the way of how the victimhood nationalism has been working in the different parts of the world through cross-references or through separately, shows us that this is a very complicated history. So if we just miss one point, sometimes we are totally, messed up and in appropriating other suffering to justify their own sufferings. This is Nagai Takashi, and this is a Röntgen photo of a Maximilian Kolbe's lung that was done by the Nagai Takashi, and even Nagai Takashi visited Maximilian Kolbe in 1933 or 34. And he even did, as a doctor, medical doctor, and they saw that, oh my God, this is a miracle that guy still can walk like this with this sort of lungs totally impaired. And then also the more worst case is Sono Ayako, who was the political aide of this this Abe Shinzo, and she was a big fan of Maximilian Kolbe. Maximilian Kolbe was beatified in 1971. She visited Poland for three weeks. She traced all the trajectories of the life of Maximilian Kolbe, and then she just expressed her disappointment with the Polish ignorance of Maximilian Kolbe. And the Kiseki, this is miracle, is her novel. And also, if you read this novel, this is very poor, but you can see that every two pages stresses how patriotic Maximilian Kolbe's family was. And we can see that why did Maximilian Kolbe's the nationalist interpretation of Maximilian Kolbe has been connected to the Sono Ayako. In 1971, she wrote about this. And then later, she made a scandal by writing that the Japanese government should adopt apartheid as a model for the policy about the foreign gastarbeiters. But I think that, yes, might be too far-fetched to directly connect her miracle or her love for Maximilian Kolbe to her advocacy for of apartheid, but I could see certain thread, common thread, running through those different stages of our lives. This is already 1971, and Jan Józef Lipski made a contribution to the Catholic Weekly. It's it's called his Father Kolbe and My Visioning. My Visioning is a journal that Maximilian Kolbe used to publish. And then, okay, I don't care, it's a Catholic festival, but I would say that one need to actually mark a Maximilian Kolbe was not free from that sort of anti-Semitism. But later numbers, actually, they also published later John Paul II's advocacy, because Maximilian Kolbe was a protege by the John Paul II, while John Paul II was a cardinal in Krakow. So this also, although different stories are involved in this, this is a sort of march, a peace march from Hiroshima to Auschwitz. Actually, it was 36 photos that was taken by the Polish journalists are now kept in the Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw. This is in Japan, the Hiroshima anti-A-bomb peace activists, they organized a march from Hiroshima to Auschwitz to Auschwitz in 1962. It took 8 months for them. So, but how many Holocaust courses were taught in the whole United States in 1963? Zero? No, one. Big difference. So, according to the Peter Novick's book, Holocaust in the United States, I think he picked up 1966, but 1966, only one Holocaust course was taught in the whole United States. Then, compared to that, this peace march was quite, pioneering work to connect the memory of Holocaust to a memory of a bombing in Hiroshima and Japan's peace activism. On the same time, but anyway, it's a little bit, how can I say, so weird, right? To find the Buddhist monks in the Auschwitz with this Auschwitz image, with this, pajama look like these striped, these uniforms. Also, Japanese, this is a Viktor Frankl's book, In Search of Meaning. It was translated in 1955. But that's very interesting. If you read the editorial note to this Japanese version of Viktor Frankl's In Search of Meaning, in the editorial note, he wrote that in order to remind us of Nanjing Massacre, we also need to really remember Holocaust things. So through the cross-reference Holocaust, those editors of this book, Mizuzu Shogo, actually try to remind Japanese of the Japanese atrocities they had perpetrated in China. Okay, I will not. But this is really a good example to show this how the cross-referencing the Holocaust in Japanese memory could work out in a more self-critical way. This one, it was taken by a very luxurious hotel projected by Ando Tadao in the Awajishima in front of a very rich Osaka University research group invited us for a week in this. And on the way to breakfast, I could see this Anne Frank panel then. This is total mismatch. The really rich Japanese people were spending their summer holidays in the Awajishima Hotel, and in the lobby of that luxury hotel, there was a certain sign of exhibition of Anne Frank. All those things. So really intermixed the critical and also, how can I say, self-advocative memories has been done like this. This is a Sugiura Chiune's consul in Kaunas in Lithuania. Sugiura Chiune, who issued the transit visa to more than 2,000 Jews, almost more than 6,000 Jews couldn't save them. But this, according to my Polish friend, they call it rescue stunt. Now every country try to find out the Jewish rescues in our nation, and as a way of showing how tolerant and generous and multinational our national culture was. But actually, Jie-Hyun was so he went to Russian school in Harbin. He was a sort of chief of this anti-Russian spy network. Also, the Polish colonel of the military information service has worked for this Jie-Hyun in the Kaunas. And this is the left guy is the director of Yad Vashem, and center is the Israeli ambassador to Lithuania. Right guy is Japan's ambassador to Lithuania. So there was a world premiere when I visited Kaunas, November 5th, 2022. There was world premiere of the Lena Auerbach Symphony 6 that was dedicated to the memory of Jie-Hyun, and the Yad Vashem commissioned that the orchestra, that symphony to the Israel. Of course, China could find that they own Chinese Schindler, but I'm not against this sort of, they are finding out Schindlers in China and Japan. Problem is that they never ever try to find out the good Japanese or good Chinese who try to rescue Asian neighbors. Because rescuing Jews are more important or more appealing to the global memory space, global memory culture, than rescuing their Asian neighbor. This is also, this shows how this sort of global memory culture then can, how can I say, so distort or deform their one's own memory culture. Rabe, Nanjing's hometown. This John Rabe was actually a chief of Nazi branch in Nanjing. But when you go there, the secretary, great leader Xi Jinping wrote that a great humanitarian John Rabe who rescued the Chinese. It's true he rescued the Chinese, but on the other hand, that civil side, he was also this. I'm not sure if he was really committed Nazis or not, but it's true. It does not erase that he was a chief of the Nazi branch in that. Okay. This is Korean conflict case. Is there anyone who came from Germany here? The Vigent. Even no German knows where the Vigent is. My German friend sent me an email and said, Jie-Hyun, Koreans are very strange. Why? They established a state of comfort women in Vigent. It's a Bayern. It's about 2,000 people are living. And that they established this, set up this statue in the Nepal Himalaya Park. In a remote village, and next to this statue is Japanese garden. If I establish a statue of comfort next to the Japanese garden, I could be, just immediately gone. My career would be gone. But these guys actually done this for the local politics in Korea, just before the local election. And then one Suwon mayor guy was in collaboration with the nationalist memory activists who promote, they export the suffering of Korean conflict to the other countries. They did it very strangely done this. But the other one is, Glendale. This is the one example I like the most, because Glendale is the first Western Coast town where this state of conflict was established. And I thought, why? And I could find the very strange names and all those Armenian surnames. Actually, Glendale was the biggest American Armenian community in the whole United States. So all those city council members of Armenian Americans, they supported this actually a statue of the comfort women. So we can see the certain mnemonic solidarity between Armenian Americans and those East Asian women's rights activists. Okay, this is American things. I will skip all this. This is my favorite photo. This is a Holocaust memorial in Berlin. Do you know who are they? Still on this. They are Namibian memory activists who came to Germany for the negotiation of the reparation for the German genocide of Herero and Nama in Namibia. So my friend who is leading Reinhard Kessler, who is a German sociologist who has been working for this memory activism for Namibia, he made this quote for them. And the left one is, typical Armia Krajowa is a sort of symbol of Polish nationalism. But one Nigerian jazz musician who took part in this Armia Krajowa in Warsaw Rising in 1943. So even this painting, we don't have enough sources to find out trajectories of this Nigerian jazz musician. But one day, young Polish artists painted this painting, and to show that it really disrupts very much nationalized memory of Warsaw Uprising, and to translate nationalized to globalized, or to give a multicultural certain sense to the Warsaw Uprising. Okay, I stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this spectacular tour of global memory landscape. Very few people can do as well as you have done. As you put it in your book, such radical juxtaposition is a methodology that Professor Lim has excelled at. So to help us contextualize the discussion, I've invited two of my colleagues for a panel discussion. One sitting to his immediate right is Professor Hugh Agnew, who is a professor of history and international affairs. Professor Agnew is a specialist of Eastern Europe, especially with the focus on Czech nationalism. And then further right is my colleague, Professor Mike Mujisuki, with whom I have co-directed the Memory and Reconciliation in Asia Pacific project for many years. He has just retired from his position at the Seeger Center, Gaston Seeger Chair in Asian Studies, but he's taking a very active role in other areas such as writing about policy, but he has taken a very, very deep interest in the memory politics. So I would ask these two colleagues to give some brief comments, and then I would ask Professor Lim to respond. So who would like to start?
Okay, go. Sorry, go. You want to go?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Lim for the fascinating and wide-ranging and amazing juxtapositions in that lecture. The concept of victimhood and nationalism and memories certainly resonates in most of Central and Eastern Europe, going back well before the First World War, the Second World War, to the First World War, or even earlier. And the nationalisms that I've studied partake pretty strongly of some of these same ideas. When you bring in Mickiewicz and the messianistic nationalism that he brought out in his late works, the books of the Polish nation, certainly that resonates further down into the 20th century. I think there are so many parallels that I felt with the things that you were writing about in East Asia when you consider some of the literature surrounding the expulsion of Germans from the Czech and Slovak lands, or from Poland. The experiences of the settlers in the newly reclaimed territories in Polish Silesia to be living among the physical remains, the buildings, the inscriptions, the sewer manhole covers in another language that says that this territory once was Germany, even if perhaps in the Middle Ages, Polish princes ruled over it and Polish-speaking or Slavic-speaking people lived there, just really rings. And the who is a victim and who is the perpetrator, it changes dramatically as you shift the perspective that you're looking at it from. I think your point in that regard was very, very interesting. I'm reminded of the Czech Karol Havlicek Borovsky, who in 1846 wrote an article on Pan-Slavism for a nascent Czech journal, in which he talked about his own experiences as a tutor in a well-to-do Moscow business family in Russia, and what that had done to his understanding of Slav identity. And he basically said that in the quarrels between Russia and Poland, the apple of discord between them was actually Ukraine, and that resonates with the present day situation of conflict in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, in which narratives of victimization, all Ukrainians are Nazis, or Russia was our colonizer, resonate very, very clearly. So in Czech politics, the discussion includes not just Holocaust memory and the Vertreibung, the movement, the removal of the German population, but it comes into public political discourse, now transformed into the manipulation of fear of immigrants, the wave of non-white, non-European people fleeing from Africa or the Middle East and ending up in places like Prague, of course, but also even smaller towns. And so you have a major political, you have a political figure who is perhaps outsized in his impact at the moment, because his party's support is crucial to the current government in the Czech Republic, but he's actually a Japanese Czech and a racist. An anti-immigrant, tapping into all that sort of right-wing populist anti-immigrant rhetoric. The ironies are so rich. But I think also when you think about the memory politics and victimization, I have a colleague who works in Prague in a memory institute. Kateřina Králová, you probably know her. Who is herself interested in the stories of Greek children that were taken away at the end of the Greek Civil War and scattered throughout most of Eastern Europe. Or the Roma Sinti people, the people known by their neighbors pejoratively for so many years as gypsies, and their experiences during the Holocaust. Now, how does one memorialize life under communism, which is another kind of trauma that has entered into, it's not nationalism precisely, but it's a kind of political victimhood and understanding of how that works into an identity. So I think that this is a very significant contribution to the exploration of memory and history and the entangled histories of people who once lived side by side and intermingled and have now separated themselves out in our drive to create a world of ethnically homogeneous nation states. It allows for a complication of the story, which I think is an important part of the job of a historian. I always tell my students that it's more complicated than that. But I'll close there. I'd just love to hear what everyone else has to say with my perspective. But thank you so much.
So I would like to join my colleagues in thanking Professor Lim for coming to GW and giving that fascinating talk. And yesterday I spent all day reading this book, and I want to recommend this book to everyone. It's a intellectual tour de force, and I took copious notes, and you can see that I got tabs on the book. And so what I'd like to do is just focus on just one slice of this masterful study, and the major contribution is that that I think Professor Lim takes the memory studies, which tends to focus on the nation as the unit and goes beyond a comparison to look at it as a global phenomenon, as a transnational phenomenon, and reading the book gave me a lot to think about. But I just want to focus on the application of what you call the victimhood nationalism narrative template to the Japanese case. And first, what kind of provoked me from reading your book and listening to your presentation is that certainly you're focused on this particular narrative template, but the implication somewhat is that there is this inherent contradiction between a victimhood narrative and a perpetrator narrative, and it shows up very much, the example of Kawashima Watkins' book, So Far from a Bamboo Grove, and I guess I would just like to raise the question whether they are inherently conflictual. In fact, in response to the criticisms that the book received in Korea, and especially among Korean Americans, in a later edition of the book, and you have the cover of the later edition, new letter from the author to the readers, where she actually apologizes if people had the view that she was trying to ignore the suffering of Koreans by talking about the trials and tribulations of the returnees. And then she actually regrets that the Japanese government has not really apologized and has not acknowledged the suffering. So I think she's trying to somehow connect the victimhood narrative with the perpetrator narrative. And I think certainly the victimhood narrative is one of the dominant narratives in Japanese discourse since the end of the war. But when I read some of those who talk about victimhood among Japanese, they also talk about the perpetrator narrative. And so there is another narrative template which may not necessarily be exclusive. And one can wonder, can there be a fusion between these narratives? And then the second point I would like to make, I don't think you used it in your presentation, but in your book, you talk about a memory regime. And the implication is that there is a memory regime in Japan, and it is a victimhood nationalism regime. And I guess I would push back a bit on that. I mean, when I look at kind of memory, individual as well as collective memory, and contextualize it and historicize it, it is much more contested, and it's contested from the very beginning. I remember when I was first a graduate student in Tokyo, one of my friends took me to a dingy movie theater in Ikebukuro. And it was to see a 9-hour movie, 9 hour and 30 minutes of a movie that I had never heard of. And it was Ningen no Joken, the human condition. And I was just completely floored by that. I had never heard of Gomikawa Junpei. And this was a sweeping study with the top movie stars. I think it was Nakadai Tatsuya who was the star. And it was about Japan's kind of atrocities in Manchuria and the effort of this one guy to try to stand up. In the end, fails. But then later I found out that Gomikawa Junpei wrote a 18-volume novel called Senso to Ningen, War and Man, or War and Humanity, which is a continuation of this. And then there are other writers, Oe Kenzaburo, or historians, Ienaga Saburo, who basically, while acknowledging the Japanese as victims of the war and victims of militarism and the militarists, also acknowledge and emphasize the perpetrator narrative. And so, of course, there are others who glorify Japan's role as an anti-imperial kind of liberation movement. But that's one kind of perspective, but there is this other perspective. And so this leads me to the question which I've been trying to wrestle with over the last 30 years, is why over time, despite the 1995 Murayama statement that this perpetrator narrative has kind of come and has begun to fade away. And then this leads me to my third and final point is the need to kind of contextualize and historicize the current moment that we are in. And I increasingly see, in terms of memory in Japan, what we have is not a memory regime in the making, but a non-memory regime. And to me, that was the impact of the 70th anniversary Danwa issued by Abe. I mean, he kind of lines up words in it was a word salad. It was a word salad using terms of aggression or colonialism, but there's no kind of logic to it. But it's basically saying, okay, Japan has apologized and this is it. And the code word for this, promoted by the Japanese government, is we have to have a future-oriented perspective, and essentially memory is not part of kind of Japanese diplomacy. The irony here is that while the official narrative is future orientation, the establishment of a non-memory regime, the amazing thing is over the last 10 years, there's been an abundance of writing by historians and popular historians about trying to wrestle with what happened in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s. And you see television programs about this. And so on the one hand, on the official level, you have this kind of silence, deafening silence. But in the intellectual community, there's an effort to kind of engage memory. And so to bring it to the last several months, and I think Japan is at an inflection point. And it's the contrast between the Prime Minister Ishiba, who, in my view, was ousted from office by a political coup in the Liberal Democratic Party, and Takaichi, Prime Minister Takaichi. And Prime Minister Takaichi kind of manifests the kind of denial view, the no memory view of Japan. But Ishiba understood this. And after he was ousted, he gives a statement and he turns against many of his advisors, many intellectuals who said, don't issue a statement, don't issue a statement. But on October 10th, he issues a personal statement reflecting on the war. Now, I think he could have gone much further, but I just found it amazing that he said, Japan needs to learn from history, needs to squarely face the past. And he not only refers to the Constitution, he gets very close to even blaming the imperial system for the wrongs. And then he talks about the media. And he gets very close, very, very close to actually giving responsibility to the Japanese people. And the commentary among the conservative establishment was that was a horrible statement. But if you look back, in the future, I think the historical significance of that statement, because I think Japan is now on a very dangerous course. And one will look back at that statement as a warning, just like he quotes from Saito in his major speech to the Imperial Diet, in which he criticizes openly this notion of war, that there is no just war. And it's just wars are about the strong taking over the weak. And so, I think it's important to see different historical narratives. And I hope that, it's not a victimhood nationalism today, it's a no memory kind of nationalism. And I find that very disturbing. Thank you.
Respond for you. Very fundamental and substantial questions that I'm not sure if I can answer in a short minutes, but to the this Roma and Sinti and the Greek children things, I think this is one of the most crucial challenges to the memory culture in Eastern Europe, because it has been formed very much a Holocaust-centered memories. This means that also actually Roma and Sinti, other small ethnic groups suffering has been marginalized in their memory culture. So it is related with this East European, we are good whites because we never colonized. But I think from the viewpoint of internal colonialism, I think they have kept a very strong colonialist desire against these ethnic minorities, even in the interwar period. So I think that how to remember the Roma and Sinti and the other ethnic minorities other than Jews would be one of the most important challenges. And also, it is very much related things. For instance, German memory culture does not allow that sort of things. At least, for instance, any criticism of Israel as a state tends to be regarded as an anti-Semitism in the German official memories. So it's very difficult. Even 2 years ago, a Guardian reporter published a very interesting article in Guardian on the title, "If Hannah Arendt were alive in Germany, she could not have been awarded the Hannah Arendt Prize." I think it's a very, very indicative of this really problematic. But these things also, in a sense, was influencing the East European memory culture, because as a way of one of the preconditions to join the EU and the NATO was to educate Holocaust in the different levels of schools. So Holocaust-centered memory has been sort of institutionalized in the international relations. So how to, I don't say that Holocaust is not important, but how to pluralize, right? Or how to deparochialize, how to decentralize, deprovincialize this Eurocentric memory culture is one of the very important things in Eastern Europe. I think, this when the Iraq war, Iraq refugees began to swarm into the Eastern Europe. Merkel at that time, she announced that Germany will take 2 million. But at that time, the Pisowska, this Polish right-wing regime, said that we will receive 2,000 refugees. It was a joke, but these Polish, so quite good Polish historians, even they wrote in Gazeta Wyborcza, because those Western Europeans, they were colonizers, so they are experienced living with different people of different cultures. But we Poland never colonized, so we never ever experienced living other cultures. That's why we accept only 2,000. This sort of, actually memory should be really criticized from inside. But still, we don't see such a very, how can I say, apparent move toward this. And Japan thinks, oh, this is a very important, all those 3 points are very important, but I want to talk from the memory regime change. You know, from the 1999, I and then some with the Japanese critical intellectuals like Narita Ryuichi and the Iwasaki Minoru, we organized so-called East Asian History Forum for Criticism and Solidarity. Our main aim is to deconstruct and criticize national history paradigms. And I think to some extent we succeeded in the criticizing memory, the national history paradigm. Even Korean newspaper, Daily Joseon-Ilbo, published editorial to say that we need to pay attention to this sort of argument to criticize national history paradigms in these days. Then I found that, but how many people are learning about past from history books? They are learning about past from films, TV dramas, manga. And then, so I mean that, so if we leave just memory space to those publicists, right, who are also blind, who reads blind. As a historian, we need how to engage in the memory space or memory culture. I thought at the time it was one of the very important challenges. That's why I began to shift from I don't know if I was a proper historian, but from history to memory studies. And then the other things can be also the apology things and Ishiba. Yeah, I was surprised to read Ishiba's this. But also in this case, in the contemporary Japanese things, I think other than victimhood nationalism, I think this sort of post-colonial melancholy works out. I mean, when I watched the film, the Shusenso, this is it's American Japanese who made an interview that
Shusenjo.
Yes,
It's shown here in, we had
denialism of comfort in it. And then one Japanese very, looks like a very strong Japanese nationalist. And this guy, director, asked about, what do you think about Korean nationalism? And he said, oh, kawaii desu. Because they were very confident, oh, this Korean nationalists cannot be really compete with our nationalists. They were very confident, so kawaii. But I say now they say that it's kawaii. No, they kawaii. Because I think there's still, for instance, a certain change of economic relations or economic positions, right? So it's, for instance, it reminds me of the British nationalist attitude toward Irish after Ireland actually exceeded economically this position of Britain. So sort of post-colonial melancholy was out behind today's denial, because they don't have to deny this, right? I mean, okay, we made wrong, like all the other nations made wrong. Every nation made wrong, then what's wrong with this? So Japanese could be more confident in making apology. Okay, we made an apology, so you should forgive us instead of that. Okay, you don't forgive us. Okay, I will apologize. I will apologize again. What's wrong with this? But this sort of, how can I say, Japanese relatively very frugal approach to the apology, politics apology, I think comes from this sort of a post-colonial melancholy that could be found in the Britain. So I'm not sure, I'm not a Japanese specialist, but just it reminds me of certain change, right? So,
but if I can just quickly add, I think the subtext of that is what is fearful for this guy is Chinese nationalism. So that's why, by comparison, Korean nationalism seems kawaii.
Still, I couldn't feel these guys are very self-confident in the Japanese past, right? Like in Korea, you cannot compete to us. this sort of self-confidence I could see, but this sort of self-confidence began to be shattered. I think it makes a Japanese attitude in the memory things a more, more stiffer and stiffer. So it's such, but I also say that, oh, anyway, so now have a look at Ireland. There's no Irish nationalism anymore, right? So, and then, but why still Korea so much keeps such a nationalist, exclusive nationalist stance against? For example, when the Japanese emperor, there was a certain plan for the Japanese emperor to visit Korea 6 years ago. I wrote in the editorial things that, okay, why shouldn't we not this welcome Japanese emperor? So, this emperor of the neighboring country, most closest country, what's wrong with this? And then this past, we can take a different attitude. But Koreans, they never, ever really ready to accept this sort of things. But that is really difficult. So, I mean, still, I think the memory regime changed because even Abe, I think Abe, also all the politicians are relatively pragmatic. So getting votes next election is most important thing for them, many of them. So, but in a sense, sometimes I felt that both Korean and Japanese politicians, nationalist politicians, are prisoners of this very strong nationalist memory culture in both countries. So even though they want to escape from that sort of, how can I say, certain quilled sub of antagonist nationalisms, it's very difficult for them to speak publicly about this. So, I mean, those poor guys are also prisoners of this vernacular memory. Okay.
Thank you very much for both our speaker and our thank you for being very patient. I know you have many questions, but following our tradition, our first question will go to a student, if there is one.
I feel last student.
Okay, keep it short. Yes.
Okay. Thank you for this fantastic talk at this critical moment in history. My question is actually about, in your research, did you notice the anti-communist victimhood? I ask this question because in East Europe, actually the anti-imperialist victimhood and anti-communist victimhood kind of intersects. While in South Korea, interesting, this two narrative belongs to two opposite political camps. So can you elaborate this or any insight?
Yeah, yes, of course. The Stalinist victim, a victim of the Stalinist political genocide, right? It has been competing with a Holocaust victim. But because usually Holocaust victim was mainly belong to the Jewish group. Why the Stalinist victim belongs to the so-called ethnic main current group? So I mean, Poles tends to emphasize Stalinist victim more than Holocaust victim. Stalinist victim is just, recent past. But many of Poles never experienced Holocaust in person. So yeah, that would.
Yes.
Thanks so much. I learned a lot, but I have a question about how much of victimhood nationalism is for the audiences abroad, which a lot of your talk is about. I haven't read the book, so full disclosure, sorry, I should. So I see all the linkages. It's fascinating the how, all the struggling for recognition, morality, legitimacy. I see all that in what you showed. But then Mike's points especially made me think how victimhood nationalism is a lot about also audiences at home. And how do you reconcile this? Because sometimes what is beneficial at the world stage to get legitimacy, although things are changing today, and maybe that's why Japan is moving that direction, I would say maybe we're moving to perpetrator nationalism at the global level, but victimhood nationalism can still be productive at the domestic level, right? So how do you see this tension between the broader international audience and what you're trying to achieve there, linking your plight or your case with the Holocaust, which has international purchase, as you see in this picture, and how does this play domestically where you may have the rise of a far-right party that says, well, it's all about, showing how strong we are, or showing, make our country great again. And that has nothing to do with anything about victimhood. It's only about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche or whatever, right? So how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not saying it's happening, but what if it does in some cases?
and I think this is also a very important question, because I say that the victim nationalism is connected with the rise of global memory space. Because domestically, always heroic nationalism has been more important. But national heroes are very often bastards from the viewpoint of neighboring nations, right? So suddenly, like I often ask my students, what's the symbol of Korean nationalism 21st century? Not anymore Lee Sun-shin, not anymore Sejong-daewang, but comfort women. Because now people began to recognize that our victimhood position is appealing to the global public sphere, and then the other people who are global community or global public sphere is more concerned about those victims. So I think those nationalists, they try to transform its discourses from heroes to victims. When I was a young boy, Moshe Dayan was our hero in South Korea too. But now it's also Holocaust.
Sangun was there.
Yeah.
This is all just enormously stimulating. Way to read the book. My head's buzzing with all the issues here, but just listening to you now brought me back to the very beginning of the talk and the quotation of Matsuoka Yosuke in 1833, leaving the League of Nations and describing Japan as Jesus of Nazareth. But it seems to me that the global memory space you're talking about, although it may have earlier counterparts, I'm guessing you frame in a post-1980s, post-1990s context. There's something that's really different. And I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on that, because Matsuoka Yosuke was referring to Japan as a victim of an unfair world system, right? Similarly, that the Chinese victim nationalism is a century of humiliation, right? This is totally different from the nature of the victim in the Comfort Women case, for example. And as you know very well, the Comfort Women case didn't start out as a nationalistic case at all. It was individual victims that actually no government wanted to listen to, right? So that is being drawn into a new memory space, and Comfort Women is one of just a number of examples. Could you talk more about what the nature of the victim is in this new memory space?
I think it is related also with first discussion. I mean, I think this fall of the Cold War, global Cold War, was a very important momentum for the widespread victim nationalism as a global phenomenon. Because during the Cold War, for instance, Koreans could not speak out against Japanese colonial atrocities because we are the allies against the communist bloc. Also, for instance, East Germany or Eastern Europe, it was not allowed to speak about the Stalinist crime and political genocide things. Even the Holocaust has been suppressed because this is our Soviet Union citizens were victimized or Poles were victimized. So even in Auschwitz, there's no separate pavilion dedicated to the Jewish victims, because all the victims were nationalized into Czech victims and Polish victims until 1969. So Cold War, in a sense, deformed a memory culture different way, but with the fall of the Cold War, certain political taboo to suppress a certain specific kind of victimhood that has been perpetrated by the other part of the global Cold War regime. So I think it was a momentum for each country that could free their memories from a certain restriction of political restriction of the global Cold War. So I think it put really a momentum for the global victim nationalism. But as you said, Jordan, you said this 1930s is 100 years of national humiliation, also much of also now we know that this a Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois visited Manchukuo and he had a talk with Matsuoka and with the Black Americans and the Japanese are same victims of the white, right? White supremacists, white nationalists, white American white. So this sort of this a interesting alliance, mnemonic alliance could be found in the interwar period. But I think that in the after 1990s, really this victim of nationalism looks like it's quite a different phase of development. So I think that collapse of the global Cold War system is very, very important. Right?
Yes, Michael.
Okay, so adding on to that previous question, do you see victimhood nationalism or sorry, I guess the global memory in space, do you see that changing now in modern times right now, or is that too difficult to say?
I think the tide began to change.
Tide is beginning.
Yeah, because I mean the post-colonial approach to the global memory culture is very, very important, especially since 2000, since the COVID era. I mean, there was a sharp debate on the Mbembe debates in Germany because on the ground that Mbembe juxtaposed apartheid with the Holocaust, and the German a combatant memory activist began to criticize Mbembe is a guy who relativized Holocaust. So relativization of Holocaust is indexed since the 1986-7 historical strike in Germany. That's why I very intentionally used the term of critical relativization. Critical relativization and radical juxtaposition. So I very intentionally avoid the term of comparison, because comparison or comparative studies always presuppose this is the main thing. This is a universal, and the other particular things can be compared in the light of universal. So always in the comparative studies, when in doing comparison, unconsciously we are hierarchizing we know what between the universal and particular. So, yeah. So I just, that's why I just stress just radical juxtaposition or critical relativization. Because the guys who say that a uniqueness of Holocaust or as a comparison is not possible say that how do they know it's not possible to compare? Because they tried. They tried comparison. And then they get, oh, this comparison is not possible. Because without trying a comparison, they cannot say comparison is not possible. So they already tried to compare. So I mean, but I don't want to be involved in comparison is right. We want to just, the critical relativization and radical juxtaposition. And we don't want to hierarchize which suffering is more. But from the viewpoint of victims, every suffering is really serious things, right? So, I mean, this sort of post-colonial approach thing is very important. So, but also, post-colonial thing has also lots of problematic. So it has its own problems like W. Du Bois and the Black Americans' approach to Japan in 1930s and the novels, right? Who expected Japan's victory in the Pacific War, and all those things really intermingled with another sort of nationalism, indigenous nationalism or color nationalism. So we need to be very careful about this.
Can I squeeze in? Yeah, just listening to this conversation has been fascinating, and I can't help, given the moment we're living in right now, wondering whether the sort of global memory culture, victimhood concepts, do you see any relevance of these ideas to the rise of the populist right as within nations, that we're victims of something, of others, of foreigners, of immigrants, and in Europe and the United States, elsewhere, this whole kind of creation of a narrative of being the victims and going back to some kind of purity that we had before.
Yeah, one of my kohai, my friend said that, Jie-Hyun, I want to modify your concept into victim racism in describing today's contemporary politics in the United States. I mean, because really white supremacists, they regard themselves as victims, right, of the DEI policies and multiculturalism, and then but I'm not sure, but I think it sounds reasonable. I don't know.
I was actually thinking of Professor Mochizuki's proposition of the non-memory regime. It could be a victim of nationalism, but not anchored at the memory, deep memory of suffering. If you consider this anti-immigration, nationalism, it's about the present. It's about the job loss of their own generation, of their parent generation. So what happened to several generations earlier seem to be less important. So maybe this non-memory regime of your memory nationalism is not unique to Japan.
Yeah, and this dovetails Harris's point. My personal view is that victimhood nationalism is problematic for the current leaders of Japan, because the one side of the victimhood nationalism is what you call absolute pacifism. Because of the suffering that the Japanese people had, and that memory still is alive. When you take polls of Japanese, most Japanese don't want to fight for their country, and that's a problem. And so the new victim narrative that's emerging in Japan is the victim of China. I mean, it's much more than immigration. China is the bully, and so totally forgetting what Japan did to China. So this is why it's non-memory. Wipe out the memory, and the Japanese should be willing to fight. And when former Prime Minister also said, the self-defense force needs to fight. They have to fight, and that's the big problem for Prime Minister Takeichi, because it's still this victimhood nationalism, which is kind of this absolute pacifism, still is there, and you want to wipe that out by wiping out all the suffering that the Japanese. To delete that from your collective memory, and I think that's what's happening in Japan today.
But I think these can be both of the last points can be combined, Mark, in the sense that I think in your work, I don't know how explicit it's in the book, but in what you presented, you did imply that the definition of what a victim is constantly contested, and it's kind of decided by politics. And I would agree that that means then the definition of the victim is not about the past. It's more about the present and the future. So it's in a way nostalgia for the future rather than the past in a way of, it's not about so in that sense, it's always about the present and the future, regardless of what the content is. So that's not as contradictory, it's just that at some point in time, the definition of victimhood by certain political elites in Japan was considered A, and now it's considered B, and if they have enough power to impose it. But what I was suggesting was that what if victimhood as a genre stops being something that brings legitimacy, recognition, and morality in the world system to begin with? And that goes back to your point, like, is the global space, memory space, changing enough to change the ranking of morality or the evaluation system? What Hobbes would say, the Leviathan decides even what the meanings of words is. So maybe victimhood means it's not even actually valuable to be a victim. Is that making sense? Yeah. So that's where I was getting. I didn't want to be as provocative, but since everybody was, I will be.
I mean, because the reason why I insist on victim instead of victims, It's a victimhood, it's a construction, right? Regardless of whether they were real victims or not, it's construction. But this one thing, and the second thing is that, sometimes people ask me about what's your, for instance, vision or alternative for the future. I said that, for the Polish studies scholars, solidarity carries special meaning.
Yeah.
So I just use the term of mnemonic solidarity. I mean, because I'm pessimistic in my brain, but I'm optimistic in my heart. So I still want to see the possibility of mnemonic solidarity, and then sort of post-colonial criticism of this today's global memory culture might give us certain exit for this sort of mnemonic solidarity. But anyway, we should try. I agree.
There's a question in the back.
Yeah, in the Department of State, you may have already covered this. I'm here so late, I don't have the business asking a question. But we used to get briefings and talks. There was this guy, I can't remember his name, but he was a Serbian professor at UVA. And his theme was chosen trauma. And chosen trauma, and it was about Slobodan Milosevic, about the Kosovo. Victimhood is very much alive in Eastern Europe and Eastern Mediterranean. We're seeing it play out every year. But his ideas, Slobodan Milosevic and many other people today, right now in front of us, they'll reawaken or fabricate or just breathe fire back into embers of a past tragedy, disaster, and rally people by dividing them. And he was saying that's what the Serbian, when they were in the Kosovo War, and they were reawakening, like Sarajevo, the Christians and Orthodox and Catholic and Muslims and not Jews anymore, but they had been living together in peace for 400 or 500 years, and he managed to get them. But the Germans, the Nazis, I don't want to rattle on here, but they did lock up a lot. They did send Serbians to the camps, concentration camps. So it wasn't that far in the past, but he managed to breathe anger and resentment and bitterness, which is not far below the surface, and gain power by doing that. And I was just wondering, that idea, I've gone on too long here, but that chosen trauma idea, have you all read about that idea?
I think there is in other words, more plain words, I think there is a manipulation of memories. So in the Serbian case, for instance, their emphasis about this Nazis' role in the making this social solidarity drifts apart away. And also Serbian nationalists, they tend to stress on the Holocaust and how these Jews and Serbians suffered from the German occupation. And their project is supported by Yad Vashem. But the problem is that we call it screen memory. By emphasizing Serbian sufferings under the Nazi occupation, they just, sort of screen the memory of their Serbian national perpetration of these ethnic minorities during the former Yugoslavian civil war.
It was reawakened by them.
Yeah. So for them, they are reawakening, but these also sort of screen memory to just, screen this, their memory of perpetrations. So this is also one of the tactics that the victim nationalists deploys very often, I would say.
Okay, one last question.
I'm from South Korea. My name is Sang-gil Park. Okay, yes, from my very personal experience, because my father is the war orphan, during the Korean War. So they tried, during his life, always he had thought himself that he is a victim. And then he made my mother made the victim again, and then children victim again. Family of a victim so really victimhood family. But my observation in South Korea is the victimhood nationalism, and also you mentioned about the heroic
Heroic nationalism.
Heroic nationalism. This is like a coin, like a coexist concept, because the South Korea, based on this victimhood nationalism, we have built South Korea, like the miracle of Han River. miracle of Han River. So my question is the victim of nationalism and also heroic nationalism is this is somehow the same concept but the different just the opposite view. So I would like to
Two sides of the same coin. Can you take one more?
Yeah,
question?
sure.
Just, yeah, please, the last question.
Thank you so much. I really love your book. I teach comparative thought and literature at Johns Hopkins. I visited from from Baltimore to hear your talk, which was wonderful. So I was going to ask the question whether there's certain sort of a mode of reading at stake in the production of victimhood nationalism. And that question comes from the example you mentioned about the Hiage narrative, this book by Fujiwara Tei, being translated into Korean in the liberation period. Actually, the first edition of that translation, as far as I know, came out in 1949, before the Korean War. And of course, the Koreans, experienced the repatriation from Manchuria as much as the Japanese did. And it seems as though the translator and the reader from that period read that Japanese narrative as if it was our narrative, 내가 넘은 383. So, who is the I, who crossed the 38th parallel. In the narrative, it was Japanese, but, probably from the perspective of the reader, it could be the Koreans too. So there is that, kind of a mode of reading on the one hand in the liberation period. On the other hand, the victimhood nationalism can be, it seems to be produced in a kind of a bit of a different mode of reading, which is really kind of identifying yourself with the other, with other victims in a little bit of a more kind of a monolithic or sort of how to say, uncritical way. So, it seems as though there are, different modes of reading at stake here when you compare the post-Cold War production of victimhood nationalism with, different sharings and, readings of each other's memories right after the World War II, so to speak, in the liberation period. So if you could talk about that, a little bit.
Like what leads to one kind of reading versus another? Is this experience? Is the context condition? Thank you. These two questions.
Wow, so very difficult question. But I think that basically nationalism has many faces. So I mean, the heroic nationalism did not disappear at all. Has existed, but I would say that focal point of nationalist discourse began to shift from heroes to victims. That's not deniable. Not only in Korea, but in other places. And then also this mode of reading, I mean, the 1949, right? This is, for instance, I'm not sure if this question of collaboration was it, because many Koreans who migrate to Manchuria was actually, Manchuria is sort of gold rush. I mean, in the 1930s, as Japanese empire expands into Manchuria, for many Koreans who could not have really a certain, these bread and butter things in colonial Korea, and many of them went to Manchuria, and about 2 million Koreans were there. And even, we call it Manju Tuksu, means how can you say Manchuria special economic boom? Yeah, special economic boom in Manchuria in 1930s. In Korean newspapers were talking about this. So, I mean, when these guys had an empathy towards this Fujiwara Tei's Hikiage story, I mean, it's just cover up also the history of their collaboration or their motivation to immigrate. So nowadays, these contemporary Koreans who are relatively free from that past of collaboration, their approach could be different. So I mean, mode of reading is not only the sort of textual analysis, but also the readers who are read or who just appropriate this text. What's his position? Historical position and social position and different positions also made. And then how can I say certain agency of reading? We can say that. but I'm not sure. I was not there at that time.
Speaks to the importance of experience.
Yeah, I mean, because what's the name of the guy who wrote the book of the destruction of European Jewry? The American Holocaust scholar. No, 3 volumes.
Salander.
No. Before that, there's 3 volumes of the destruction of European Jewry. I mean,
Yes.
Austrian Jew who oh my.
I'm thinking of office, but I'm not
This is
sure.
the one.
University
At Vermont historian, right?
Yeah, but he was a very much positivist historian. He just researched all the documents whose shelf more than 8 kilometers. But although, despite his very much positivistic approach, later years he wrote an essay. I was not there. He said, I was not in the concentration camp. Am I right to write about this? But
Raoul Hilberg.
Raoul Hilberg, yes, Raoul Hilberg. In his later years, he wrote that essay. But this is very moving essay, especially from the very much positivistic historian. I was not there, so I'm not sure if I am right in describing all those things. But this is a, how can I say, our professional moral to approach the past. In a sense.
Well, suffice to say, you put more issues on the table, resolving less than 2 hours. But thank you very much to our speaker, Professor Lim, and our discussant, and to the audience for your patience and participation. Thank you.